Good to see everyone. A challenging chapter. The truth is, I'm finding all these chapters challenging. It's not my wheelhouse, the prophetic parts, prophetic literature of the Hebrew Bible. I'm more of a narrative guy. And and I'm good. I'm good. I'm very happy to be challenged in this way. I tried something a little bit different, and hence the apology for 2 pages, or if you do double side or the extra piece of paper, I usually try to limit it to 2 sides of 1 page. And the reason I did that is I wanted to experiment with having the English opposite the Hebrew and to break down the poetics even more. So it is something based on one of our participants who knows a little bit of Hebrew. And was looking at the poetic aspects of this. So that's why it looks the way it does today, with shorter sentences, especially when I got more into it on the second and third page, where I really broke down each verse to phrases. It enables those who are using the Hebrew to more easily find, and perhaps it'll enable us to read this a little bit differently. So not just to be preoccupy ourselves with the content involved, but also with the form as well. Okay, does anybody want to say something that's come up in the past few weeks of thinking, of pondering about our study together that doesn't fit exactly into a question or a comment on one of the verses? I ask this because there's nothing I study that doesn't reflect immediately for me on the war in Gaza, Israel, and my own identity as a Jew and my own identity as a Zionist or a liberal Zionist, which is being heavily, heavily challenged now, not just by the war, but also by a book that I've recently read by my friend and teacher, Shaul Magid, about the necessity of exile in Jewish thought. It's not an academic book so much. There are some footnotes, but mostly it's a popular book. It's a very personal book for him as well. And it has me evaluating and reevaluating many of the things that I thought were who I was once upon a time, from a religious Orthodox Zionist to a liberal progressive Zionist, and wondering if that's at all possible. And I see everything. I see it certainly in the book of Joshua that we study together on Wednesdays, and I see it in this text in Isaiah as well, and the role of Israel amongst the nations, which will come out again today as well. So that's
The challenging part, David, that the role of Israel among the nations in this text in particular. Is that what you're referring to as a?
Also, yeah, when I mean Israel, I mean the Jewish people, the people of Israel.
Yeah.
But also the way that modern day Israel purported or presented itself, which was, here we are, we're startup nation, we're making the desert bloom, look at all the things we're doing, the Nobel Prizes, all these things are totally disproportionate. And so that's in the back. You hear this phrase that we're going to see today, or hagoyim, although it's usually misquoted, or lagoyim, a light unto the nations. The text here says light of the nations, or light be the nation's light, if you will. But yeah, that's in the background. Rita Claire, I think you wanted to say something.
No, I couldn't control my getting my video on, but it finally worked. So I was just going to ask for assistance, but
Oh,
everything's fine. Thank you.
well, here you are.
Here I
Okay,
am.
here you are. It's good to see you.
Thank you. Good to be seen.
Good to be seen. That's a
That
phrase
that was Bill's favorite expression.
uh-huh. It's an important one for us to also in light of the war, the great justified, in my opinion, need of Palestinians and in particular the Gazans to be seen, and yet at the same
My,
time,
I
Israel,
was just going to
Israeli.
say to Rita Claire, my dad's aphorism was, "So glad you got to see me today."
Indeed, each day gets a little bit better. Thank goodness.
Okay. All right. So Stephen Skopatz is asking for the Shaul.
I assume it's in English.
It is in English, yeah. Yeah, it is in English, and it has a really interesting passage from a modern Orthodox Zionist or post-Zionist, as he termed himself, who was part of the settler movement, who wrote, he died young, maybe 20 years ago already, Rav Shagar. And he's translated, Shaul has translated a passage from one of his books on post-modernity, a postmodern read on Zionism, which brought him to a position of post-Zionism, which is really interesting from a settler point of view. And these things are swishing around in my head because of when we think towards the future, what might the future be if two states are not possible for various reasons? There are those that are promoting, although they're a very tiny, small, still voice in the desert, promoting a one land with different cantons, the Swiss model kind of how part will be, Jewish, and therefore the land will be one. I mean, it's a really, really difficult thing, but it all goes back to wanting to be seen. It all goes back to it. And my other reading of this period, on the other side of the world of literature, is Barbara Streisand's autobiography, which I'm reading because believe it or not, I'm part of a book club. I decided I need to broaden my horizons, and that's got me going in other directions. So between that and reading Jimmy's book and others, I'm finding myself stretched in different directions now. A welcome stretch of being a little bit cramped up in
I
recent.
just want to mention to you that if you enjoy hearing Barbara Streisand sing, there is a special on PBS that she gave a concert in Brooklyn, and it's amazing.
Well, if you had said that to me a month ago, I would have said I'm not interested. I've never been interested in music, but now I am. So thank you. Yeah, Sasha thinks it's cute that I put Barbara Streisand on Spotify, a mix of a song list of hers while I'm reading. I figure that's the least I can do for decades of ignoring her entirely. Okay, let's anything else, or shall we move ahead? So these are big pieces to bite off, I understand, but I tried to divide them according to the signs that the Hebrew editor author has given us. And very often that has to do with listening and that quote that we see so often, that opening, Ko Amar Adonai, and thus said God. So should we any volunteers to read? This reading's a little bit different than narrative, so it's, and if whoever reads it, they could read slowly, a little bit slower than you. Go ahead, Steve.
That's Talmadge Hill Metro North Station, correct? Yes. It's a commuter rail station, right? Yes.
Okay, we have a problem here. Okay, hold on.
Let me just ask a little bit about Lapham Road. Lapham Road, I noticed, we can go back to some of those pictures that we just looked at. I think number 12.
I'm looking for who that might be, and I can't find.
There's a double, this is I guess 11. There's a double yellow line.
Okay, so Stephen Byrne, it was actually the voice in the back of your. I muted you for a second because we had somebody else's voice back there.
Oh, we're not talking about the American. I'm asking, is it a well-traveled road? Yes. It's not
Yeah.
a remote part of town where only local residents would be,
Sorry,
right?
we don't hear you, we hear somebody else. Sorry,
Steve, you might need to sign off and try to sign back on. You're garbled.
yeah, it sounds like somebody else is on your wavelength. Okay. All right, so why don't we go ahead and Wayne, why don't you go ahead and read the first bit for us?
Sure. Slowly as instructed. Listen, O coastlands, to me, and give heed, O nations afar. God appointed me before I was born, naming me while I was in my mother's womb. My mouth was made to be like a sharpened blade. While I was hidden in the shadow of a divine hand, so that I was like a polished arrow, concealed in God's quiver. And God said to me, "You are my servant, Israel, in whom I glory." I thought, I have labored in vain. I have spent my strength for empty breath, but my case rested on God. My recompense was in the hands of God, of my God.
Okay. Feelings and comments and impressions and questions.
This kind of reminds of Jeremiah's call. Before I was born, naming me while I was in my mother's womb. It's clearly back to from God's voice to Isaiah's voice. So we've shifted. And what I really like about this whole chapter is that dialogical back and forth. There's the Psalm 139. There's a deep sense of vocation, of calling to an appointment. And but then I love that I thought, I have labored in vain and spent my strength for nothing, empty breath, but then turns back the attention, but I'm in the hands of my God.
You mentioned Jeremiah here. We're going to see throughout this whole chapter. I didn't bother making all the notations, but there are so many parallels with text from the Psalms, one you mentioned right now. This is a sure sign of late biblical literature, right? When something is quoting so much of the other, that's a sign. And that's also part of what not only biblical literature is, but also rabbinic literature. And I'm guessing all religious literature. It's a constant recycling. While there's creativity, at one point something is entirely different, but very often the creativity lies in the recycling of previous materials, which is for me is a wonderful metaphor for in general. We don't stand, human beings, we don't keep the same things for hundreds and hundreds of years. Very rare, and sometimes we keep them just to look at them, right? We don't use something for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years by and large. Some things we do, and that's interesting, why some things last and some things don't. The same thing in literature, of course, right? But we're constantly recycling pieces and parts, and so is the earth, so is creation, so is the universe, for that matter, right? So the recycling, there's the weaponizing here of prophecy, literally weaponizing, right? More than anything else, that's who we kind of think of Jeremiah often as being that angry, frustrated man who nobody's listening to. That's oversimplification, of course. But I see that in the middle paragraph, right? My mouth was to be like sharpened blade. My mouth, and that the mentioning of the juxtaposition of mouth and blade is interesting because the tip of the blade or the sharp part of the blade is called in Hebrew pi hacherev, the mouth of the blade, because, well, there's two interpretations. One is, I'm beginning to see, I thought that for years because one of the first interpretations I saw, and it's written in a traditional kind of a conservative, little c conservative commentary written in the 70s, I think, in Israel, in which Amos Chacham, he in one of the commentaries, he shows a picture. The story of Eglon, Ehud and Eglon in Judges 3, where Ehud has a stiletto, which is pointed out because swords in those days were more like sickles, and you would hit somebody, you would chop them down, and that's the language of doing it. It's not stabbing. That story is unique in that it's stabbing. It's not like we would think, it's clanging of swords, but it's more like hitting with swords, and that's the word that's used, to hit with a sword. And the swords, because they're sickle, it looks like a mouth. And so he said, well, that's why we have the language mouth of the of the sword. I don't think that's correct anymore. I think it's more correct to think in terms of the sword devours, which I think we say in English as well. And I don't know if that's based on biblical Hebrew, but the sword devours. Eating and killing is a language for death, for defeat and death. As we're going to see, eating themselves as well, which comes up here as later
This
on.
also reminds of text in the New Testament. You know, the word of God is like a two-edged sword.
Based on biblical Hebrew.
Mhm.
Absolutely, yeah. Cherev pifiot. Cherev pifiot. Pia cherev pifiot is the two-edged two. And we use that double-edged sword. I don't know if you use that yeah, okay, we're getting off on a tangent. And then the other thing is not weaponizing of prophecy. Prophet as a in many ways it's a political move, right? And then the self-doubt that you mentioned, Stephen, I think every good leader has a certain measure of self-doubt. Didn't think I was succeeding, but then God comes in to say the next bit. Any other comments or questions about this?
Is it fair to ask if folks today, or maybe all of us who have that capacity to hear such a call, to hear this strong appointment for mission as a servant, you know, serving a larger purpose? I'm not sure what to make of this in this day and age, but we don't have to belabor it now, but I just raised that question. A lot of folks feel called by God, you know, and that's a kind of authority that's hard to. What confirms that? What does that mean? What does that look like? So,
Yeah, the people that usually ask those questions, and what I found, Stephen, are the ones who are clergy or deacons are very, very active, or in a more secular, with less God language and more secular language, those that are, you know, have devoted their lives to nonprofit work in the most difficult places, right? For me, an interesting examination of that would be, well, how does that interact with how does that dance around with one's ego? You know, the feeling of being called, and what's the correlation between that and one's self-importance? And the importance of knowing that, and the dangers of that getting out of control as well. Yeah. Apropos leaders and lack thereof. Okay. Anything else? All right, Jimmy, you want to read the next section for us, 5 to 6?
No, unfortunately, I wasn't unable to print it out. So,
All right. So Frank, we'll find somebody eventually.
you're muted, Frank. Frank, you're muted.
I don't know how that happened. And now God has resolved, the one who formed me in the womb, to be of service, to bring back Jacob and restore Israel. And I have been honored in the sight of God. My God has been my strength. And God has said, it is too little that you should be my servant, in that I raise up the tribes of Jacob and restore the survivors of Israel. I will also make you a light of nations, that my salvation may reach the ends of the earth.
If you have any wisdom for us on this, Frank?
No, I'm still thinking about the call. I have two children. One daughter's a little older than my son. My son felt the call when he was 6, 7 years old. He's like a little desert father. And my daughter was much more secular for a number of years. And I just wonder about that. It's just an amazing, it's an experience, a sense of things that's unprovable, but it's just so strong for those that get it or have it. They don't choose it, it comes to them. It just amazes me. Completely alien to many people, but really a very palpable experience for some. I'm just still musing about that.
Hmm.
And then thinking about it spreading out and somehow enlightening the wider world is an amazing story. That's,
And in looking, trying to take a look at, in your case, two children with different developments, we wonder how much, of course, comes from the womb. How much comes from the womb and how much comes from the room. You know, from once the kids are born, what's clear here is that this is destiny. It's almost fate. It
Mhm.
challenges a little bit of the freedom of choice tenet that we like to think of. And then of course this issue that I examined for myself is the wanting to be beyond, the desire to solve a larger universal problem in the individual, because this is individual writing this or saying this, and how much of that is indeed from God, and how much is that is from the ego, the individual's ego.
And what is the experience of being honored in the sight of God? And you mentioned clergy use this language, I think, a lot more than lay folks, right? Of being called. And that's just kind of, you go to a clergy conference and tell me about your call, or when the search committee is trying to discern your calling. It's you know, there's criteria for what constitutes that. And you know, some folks just insist on it, and it feels irrational, and others it's a byproduct of a search that's been ongoing. So it's a fascinating question. But again, to feel honored in the sight of God, to then not puff up, but to, as it says, God has been my strength. I have labored, and there is a humility here that comes across in this particular text. And then as a result, I love how God doubles down and says, you know, it's a lot more than what you think. We're moving beyond the tribe to the greater world.
Yes, Stephen.
And that last line with my salvation may reach the ends of the earth, it just doesn't seem to ring true. It sounds like a proselytizing. And I usually don't feel like that's a Jewish characteristic.
In the commentary that I'm using, it's over there, and I never remember his name, but it's a relatively recent commentary. In his comment on this, he says, and salvation, and then like in parentheses, and of course that word means very different things for different people depending on their background. Yeah, Stephen, when I grew up, we didn't use the word salvation either. I don't know if the Christian folk know that. The Jews have an aversion to using that word salvation, and even redemption. And it's kind of a pity, because those are good words that reflect the Hebrew of Yeshua, Yeshuot v'nechamot, right? As you know, we say these words all the time, but because of the association. So maybe one way of thinking this, Stephen, is not how it was used. Perhaps maybe we'll go to that in a second with the New Testament at the end of the page. But maybe how it could be meant here is it's not about religious thought, it's about justice.
Okay.
You know, Yeshua, if we think of Yeshua, So again, that problem with that word salvation, but if we just say, use the Hebrew for a while, Yeshua. Yeshua are people that are in dire need of help because they're dying or because they're oppressed.
hmm
There is no justice. That Yeshua comes to all those people. And it's not about being transformed into light and going into another world. Yes, in mystical circles it is, and perhaps in different, I don't know, but it's less about that. What I think perhaps what's bothering you, Stephen, and please tell me if I'm reading into it so much, is when somebody says to you, "I've seen the light."
It's not so much that as just the idea that somehow following this path is going to save you. Yeah, I feel like that's more of a, well, like I said, looking that somehow I feel like that's more something I get from Christian friends that they're saved. And so I take that word salvation kind of in that way. And that more saved from what, that's.
In this
So I
case,
like the term justice better. Yeah.
in this case, however, they are in exile. They need to be saved from captivity.
hmm
And so much of Second Isaiah points to, Cyrus is coming and we're going to return, and despite all the hardships, all will be well. And for those who trust the Lord, so to speak.
And speaking of Cyrus, in 42, chapter 42, we had this light of nations referring to Cyrus. So it's being used in a different way here.
Right.
Megan, you wanted to say something?
Yes, if I could, first I want to say hi to Richard. I see him pop up now and then. Richard,
Richard.
so good to see you. Yeah.
Thank you.
I'm back here and I had to look up the word recompense, which is like wages or stuff, but it's also a paying back for what was put upon you. It's an amend payment. So when I read this, it does go into, I like justice better than salvation. But it does go into, for me, the idea is this is really hard to be, it came from the womb, and it's hard to be, to feel as if God, or that energy of God, is telling me I have to do this, say this, be this. It is a destiny rather, or a fate that what you do with it is your destiny. I think he could have turned away from it. He could have said, this is, I mean, I think people can turn away from feeling as if they have to do something, but it does feel like a lot of the prophets, or the people who are, quote, or people who say they're chosen, it is an ego. They are lightened, instead of, if you are caught in some destiny or some life situation, it's really hard to work through it. Be what you're intended to be for that, and what you didn't expect. So I don't know. That's all I was saying, because I had to look up recompense and think, I think it means being paid back, but I think it means more.
Yeah, recompense here translates the word mishpat, which is justice. In other words, why they chose this particular English word here, I don't know. Achen mishpati, indeed but my justice.
My just
No, I'm sorry. Mishpati is but my case is mishpati. See, this is where I should have broken it down to even more than I broke down here. The upalti et Elohai, and my recompense was in the hands of God. Palti is from the word to act, action, my actions. I'd have to look and see where else polity is used in this way, why they use the word recompense. But what's clear that it's parallel, that's why the format here is important. The parallelism of the Hebrew poetics here is that very often we know what one word means, even though it's used differently than other contexts. We know because the context in which it's used here, there's this synonymous parallelism that's all through this chapter, all through biblical poetry, not always, but more very, very often. Megan, as to your comment about people could, whoever the individual is, they could refuse, right? They don't have to take the job. And we'll never know how many of those there were that God called out to because they didn't write books. We only have the books of the ones that wrote, that shared with us their, if, yeah, I mean, who writes books? People today, who writes books? The people that can sell books, right? Or somebody thinks they'll be able to sell a book unless they self-publish, but they write because they've answered a call of sorts, I guess. Yeah. And if not, sometimes people write books about them, I guess. I don't know.
Don't we all have a call? If we're honest enough, and it doesn't make one a light to the nation. I even in groups that I'm in where somebody will say, I'm Jewish and we're supposed to be a light to the nations. I'm thinking that's a little, so I'm glad you talked about that. These are big callings that are written about, as you say, but everybody has a fate, destiny, and however you want to play with that. But
well, one might say that everybody has their own light to shine.
yes,
However small and narrow beamed it might be. Spark, you may know that Hasidic sources distilling Kabbalistic literature, and again, that I'm not an expert at this anyway, there's this term called pintaliyid, the point of light in the Jew. It's very Jew specific. It's very chosen people specific, that each end of the soul of a Jew is a kind of a light that has potential to shine onwards. Of course, in a more universal way of reading that same literature, one could just apply it to all human beings. That one could easily say that's what it means to be created in the image of God. To be created in the image of God is to have that little bit of light that you shine. Yeah. So thanks. Yes, Frank, go ahead.
I just think when I stand in line at the grocery store and read stuff in popular magazines, I mean, they're celebrity, but I'm struck by how many of these people talk. It's a kind of authenticity. They experience a call to be myself, or to recover myself, or to get back to myself. That seems to be a kind of a call that lots of folks have. It's terribly limited. I mean, it's not completely ungenuine, because it's good to be yourself rather than be under somebody's thumb or whatever, but it's very limited, but it seems to be everywhere, authenticity. And you were just saying, that does everybody have a call? A lot of people seem to experience that's their call, to be authentically themselves, which makes very little sense to me, actually.
I like the feeling of this call in this text. It's an address. So Isaiah is being addressed, and now he's asked to respond to, and he's able to make a response. He's responsible for that, recognition and acceptance or denial. But I just like that he's addressed from outside of himself. And then, as I think we see in the rest of the text, then it's a back and forth. That's genuinely dialogical. I see it with that other, with not just finding your own true self deep within and being somehow authentic, as Frank just said, but being in a relationship outside of yourself.
Megan was happy to see Richard. Just to mention to everybody else, Richard's been out of commission physically for a few weeks now. He took a not a nasty fall, but actually 2 nasty falls, and had to have his knees kind of restructured. So it's good that you just see him this part of his body, because when you look at the lower part, it gives me I feel no, makes me nervous. Anyway, but Rich is coming home tomorrow, and that's good news. So back with Harvey at home and with their lovely dog. And so for the folks here in Palm Springs tomorrow, from that time on, we kick in when making some food and helping them out what they need. Okay. All right. And for the rest of us, it's prayers to Richard for that you may walk upright and walk straight and utilize that mobility that God has given you. Okay, then. So should we go on? Stephen Burton, you ready now to give it a try? 7?
Is this better?
Yes.
Yeah.
Perfect.
Okay. I think I had my microphone somewhere else, so sorry about that.
That'll do it. Got to be careful with that kind of thing.
Thus said God, the Redeemer of Israel, his Holy One, to the despised one, to the abhorred nations, to the slave of rulers, kings shall see and stand up, nobles, and they shall prostrate themselves, to the honor of God who is faithful, to the Holy One of Israel who chose you.
Okay. So Stephen might be saying to himself, again, I'm going to put words in his mouth here, Stephen Skopats, that here it is, that religious thing, the projection of it will only work if those kings and queens, those noble people, if they accept God as one. And that is a religious thing. That's proselytizing, right? The other side of that, I'd ask everybody to consider is we're now reading in the Torah portion, the weekly Torah portion in Jewish communities, we're reading the Exodus story. This week is the first of the 7 plagues. So that's where we are in the story. And it seems from the story, of course, that on one hand, it is saving the salvation of the Israelite people, Israelite nation who are enslaved. But it's also, and maybe even more so, God becoming God. God becoming not God of a few families that are strung together in a very small tribe, but God becoming the God of the world as it was known at the time, right? Between Egypt and up to Mesopotamia. And God shows that God is God and is the one and the only ruler and the only one God, because God can make all these things happen in nature, can turn nature topsy-turvy and create a political situation in which the Israelites would be allowed to leave and then wander in the desert, etc. So it's not just about the salvation part of it, the need of the people. It seems, at least from our text, it's also about God's need to be worshipped as one. And that's a little bit, and worshipped as one has political implications, not just religious implications. To me, that's personally, Steve, that's what I'm focusing on. I focus on those in power need to understand that they're not really in power, right? They don't really have the essence of power. They think they're in power, and therefore they're symbolically are the ones that need to bow down to the power.
Okay, makes sense.
That was a nice riff.
Yeah.
Yep.
All right, so Steve Byrne, why don't you go ahead and read the next part as well?
Okay. Thus said God, in an hour of favor I answer you, and on a day of salvation I help you. I created you and appointed you a covenant people, restoring the land, allotting anew the desolate holdings, saying to the prisoners, go free. To those who are in darkness, show yourselves. They shall pasture along the roads. On every bare height shall be their pasture. They shall not hunger or thirst. Hot wind and sun shall not strike them. For the one who loves them will lead them and will guide them to springs of water. I will make my mountains a road, and my highways shall be built up. Look, these are coming from afar, these from the north and the west, and these from the land of Sinim.
No reactions or,
It made me think a little of Psalm 23, some of the wording in there. So,
also Psalm 131, where we look up to the mountains and God will protect you from being struck by the sun or by the moon. Absolutely. That was my comment before, that this is literature that is based on, is recycled all sorts of other literature as well. For those that are not familiar here, who are not familiar with Jewish liturgy, the prayer book, the Jewish prayer book, is also in some of the prayer book there are full quotes of full psalms, like the whole psalm is there. But in lots of the prayer book, and certainly as you get into the Middle Ages, in the poetic text, the piyutim, it is snippets and snippets that have been glued together, cut and pasted together to create new ideas and new situations with the same language. So whereas those psalms that we referred to that were recognizable to you, that you recognized, or the echoed, they are said, like Psalm 23 is a very personal psalm. It's very, so is 131. Lift up my eyes, to whom do I ask for help? I'm pretty sure it's 131. I'm not always good with numbers, but I think you know which one I'm talking about. Those are very personal. Here that's brought into or brought out from the personal to the communal, to the collective.
David, is this one of the texts you are referring to as challenging? I created you and appointed you a covenant people, restoring the land, allotting anew the desolate holdings.
Yeah. Yeah, that is in the background. So there's two challenges here. Look at what we're doing now. First of all, it's very personal, right? And maybe sometimes it's better it's not on Facebook, but I'm not embarrassed to talk. I'm not bashful about talking about that. Embarrassed, not the right word, but I'm not bashful about talking about these things. I think these are the conversations that we need to have, not just Jews and Christians, but Jews amongst themselves, and certainly Jews with Muslims as well. And inshallah, may that day come that we can go back to speaking with each other. But one of the, and so what we're doing today is talking about the challenge of salvation, of using that English word, or the calling the clergy use. By the way, when I meant clergy, talk about where Jewish clergy, rabbis talk about, when did I get the idea, what moved you to become rabbi? They don't really use the word calling. That too is thought of as in a Christian sense. They mean around the same thing, but they won't use the actual word in English, calling. The fact that we're talking about this stuff is really important. This is the exchange that we desired, that Steve Kinney and I desired, we're really looking for when we opened up this group to talk about Acts and now Second Isaiah. We've got some noise in the background, somebody. So if you're not speaking, if you could mute yourself. So two challenges here. Back to your question, Steve. Yeah, one is, even before we get to the idea of the land and going back to the land, which doesn't need to be problematic. There are ways to be in the land and to coexist. I believe that needs to happen. So to restoring the land, yes, in the same way the land was restored to the Jewish people in a way, in a global kind of sense, after the Holocaust, not necessarily because of the Holocaust, that of course started beforehand, but because of the need of Jews not being able to survive in a fitting way outside on their own under the auspices, in many cases, of the church, but not only. The restoring of the land, in the same that we received that restoring of the land, that it's incumbent upon us to make sure the land is restored to those that were living there for hundreds of years while we were not. Okay, so but before that is something a little bit more surprising, and that is the language that comes at the end of the first page. I created you and appointed you a covenant people. Etzocha ve'etnecha, I created you in one word. I created you, that's one word in Hebrew. And I appointed you, that's one word. I gave you two. Brit, so Brit, you may know from the Ashkenazic pronunciation, a bris. Do our Christian friends know what a bris is? Circumcision. Yes. The Yiddish pronunciation of a circumcision. So a mohel is the one who does the bris, but it's actually in Hebrew mohel and brit. What people very often don't realize when they're doing the circumcision, when they're doing the ceremony, is that the circumcision is only a sign of the covenant between the people of Abraham going forward and God. So that includes, of course, Muslims as well, which is easily explains it being the people of Ibrahim, and ourselves. So that's the explanation as to why it's done. Why most Jews do it today, I'm talking about Jews right now, even if they feel uncomfortable doing it from a psychological point of view, from a physiological point of view, and there's lots of arguments from a political point of view, from a human rights point of view, you hear, believe me, I've been involved in these conversations for decades now, is that the reason they'll do it is because of the taboo of not doing it. I'm personally involved with an organization called Bruchim, which does what it can to welcome families, Jewish families who have decided not to do a circumcision for their sons, to make sure they're welcome in Jewish communities. And surprisingly, in some Reform communities, they're not welcome. They're told we're not, you can't have a bar mitzvah if you can't. I think that's rather rare, but there are cases like that. What bothers me of this whole thing of the Brit, and then I'm going to end my way too long comment here, is less the cutting of the flesh. And of course, we have 5 daughters, so we never had to be parents to that. But for me, it's more the language of Brit, of covenant. And so the ceremonies that we did for our twins, and then when I went on to almost to basically to create liturgy for welcoming of children at birth, to be done in a synagogue or in a home with different blessings. I stayed away from covenant language because that in itself seems to be, a covenant is something you want to go into knowing with your eyes open and not forced upon you, you're forced into it. And that's something that I think those of us that are certainly in the United States and emphasize free of choice, we have a real problem with. And it's a justified problem. What do you mean? You're putting me in this covenant and I don't have a choice in things like my religious freedom or my thought, my ideas about God. And so that to me is challenging. I know that's not what perhaps you expected. That's not, but because of that and these kinds of verses, that's all part of the chosen people complex that we have. Complex, I'm not saying in a judgmental way right now. It happens to be a complex of various verses and stories that lead us to this concept of chosen peoplehood. And so those are the things that are challenging.
Nice, thank you. But notice at the heart of this mission, of this calling, is to set the prisoners free, to feed the hungry.
And
lead folks to good harmony and sustenance.
Right, and I would say from a universalist point of view, right? This is not just our people. That's why studying and even using these texts in liturgy are important, because it's not just about us. Yeah. I mean, go one by one here, right? Pasture along the roads, those in darkness, prisoners, hunger and thirst, the sun, the elements, exposed to the elements, the water, clean water to drink, the being able to pass from one area to another, to the highways, all the destruction. This is me, that just right in the background.
And again, there is this relationship with the other. The one who loves them will lead them. So you have this love relationship between creator and created that is, sometimes we hear it so much we forget how radical it is, but it's there.
If, with your permission, the next section I'm going to read, and I'm going to read it in Hebrew and in English as a prayer. Maybe that's why I isolated, although there were reasons also to isolate this on his own from a literal point of view, but with all that I just said about caring and being concerned for those living in Gaza and those in the West Bank who are now under greater persecution than they usually are. In the end, I am a Jew. In the end, I am an Israeli. And we can't have the same amount of intensity of compassion at the same time for everybody in the universe. We're not equipped to do that. The Talmud talks about Aniei ircha ve'aniei ir acheret, aniei ircha kodem. If you are confronted with only so much money and you have the needy of your own town versus the needy of another town, you're to give to the needy of your town first. That is, and those are the choices that we make. And this in no way whatsoever excludes having compassion and being attentive to the suffering of the other. But for me, this section, this paragraph here stood out as a prayer of where I would like to be a yearning, a prayer of yearning. Roni shamayim v'gili aretz, yiftzechu harim rina, ki nicham Adonai amo. Inyan Yerach, I can't read it, Sasha. What's the Nikud? Oniyav, sorry. Oniyav Yerachem. So shout out heavens and rejoice, O earth. Break the shouting, O hills. For God has comforted this people and has taken back its afflicted ones in love. That's the prayer that I hope we will be praying soon, and I hope that Palestinians will be praying it as well. I hope that those in the Sudan who are suffering, and those who are in Syria who are suffering, and those Ukrainians who are suffering, and those Russian soldiers that are against their will being forced to fight. I hope that all those who are suffering would be able to say this as a prayer and to feel that the hills indeed are part of this, the heavens, the hills, the creation itself. Okay. Thank you for indulging me.
Do you mind reading that one more time in Hebrew? Now that I'm focused on it.
I need to get my glasses because the font is so small and I don't read the vowels properly. Roni shamayim v'gili haaretz, yiftzechu harim rina, ki nicham Adonai amo, aniyav yirachem. Okay.
That's more winsome to the ear than the English
Yeah.
text.
We don't have, I don't have Robert Alter's full translation of the Hebrew Bible, but this would be a case to look at his because he's a man of literature, of English literature as well, not just Hebrew literature. And in his translation, he endeavors to reflect as much as possible the poetics of the Hebrew. And I only have his translation to the Torah and maybe wisdom literature. I just never got the whole set. Yeah. I'd say that, yeah, I could say something like it just seems to be too expensive, but of course, I spend a lot of money on books. Mostly I'll just blame it on my wife, not allowing me to have more books at the house. Like that stopped me. Okay. All right, I could blame it on the treasurer. The Orami Bar treasurer says, no, there's no money, no more money for books for you. That's what Richard wants to tell me. Okay, shall we try to get in one more section? I'm going to finish everything today, but maybe we'll take a break from this and go back to the light of the nation issue and go to talk about prayers, talk about using scripture or creating a prayer from other verses. Luke 2, and I didn't ask you to prepare this beforehand, Steve, but perhaps you can give us some background on this. This is a man, Shimon, Simon, who is not of the regular. This is a separate character, if I understand correctly, right, Steve?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and we don't know much about him, or we don't know anything about him, and he is there to let Jesus's parents know what needs to be done. I always thought this was the circumcision, but this is not the circumcision. This is a 40-day. What I understand now is when the mother would come to be purified. The biblical text in Leviticus stipulates exactly when purification after birth needs to happen, along with bringing an offering, and so this is possibly the 40 days. Anyway. would somebody like to read this? So, since I read the passage in Isaiah, Stephen, Kenny, why don't you go ahead and read this section?
Now there was a man in Jerusalem whose name was Simeon. This man was righteous and devout, looking forward to the consolation of Israel, and the Holy Spirit rested on him. It had been revealed to him by the Holy Spirit that he would not see death before he had seen the Lord's Messiah. Guided by the Spirit, Simeon came into the temple, and when the parents brought in the child Jesus to do for him what was customary under the law, Simeon took him in his arms and praised God, saying, "Master, now you are dismissing your servant in peace, according to your word. For my eyes have seen your salvation, which you have prepared in the presence of all peoples, a light for revelation to the Gentiles and for glory to your people, Israel."
This section, I can't pronounce it. It's Nunc Dimittis. Did I pronounce that right?
Yeah, the Latin for the now my eyes have seen, I think, or what is nunc? Is never. What does that mean in Latin? Somebody?
It's missing now.
Now.
Yeah, it's now.
Now yeah. So, and is that something in the Episcopal tradition that is said as a prayer? I think it is in the Roman Catholic tradition.
Sure. Yeah, especially in the season of Christmas or.
There's a song of Simeon that I know they sing it often at church after a gospel reading. They'll, it's, I think the title of it is The Song of Simeon, and it echoes these words.
Right. So the use of
it's in the prayer book service of the Episcopal Church as well, right?
Yeah.
Morning prayer.
Yeah. So another goal that we've had in this group is to share not only our ideas and our understandings of reading, but to share the experiences. And I did share my experience of birth ceremonies, but here's something from the liturgy, out of liturgy, that uses this text. This is not a quote, right? In the beginning, you look at it and it seems like, well, where is Luke quoting from? But is Luke, what's the history of this prayer? This is new to me today. I've never really delved into. While we did Acts together, I never really did Luke in a terribly deep way. But for my eyes have seen your salvation, that's out of Isaiah 52:40. And I think this part here is definitely out of ours. The word used for revelation here in the Greek is the same as apocalypse, the same word that we use as apocalypse. Gentiles means the nations. Laos here, I think. So this is Stephen Skopatz. This is very much a Christian use of the term. There's another, we did in Acts once, we saw where this was the message in one of the synagogues on Shabbat, if I remember correctly, in Acts 13. And so, this became very much a sisma, chomim sisma. Doesn't matter. A tagline, not a tagline, but it became very much part of Christianity. But it was in Judaism before that, and the idea is that it didn't really work as a people or as an individual, whether it's second Isaiah as that prophet or not. But this is part of when we set out to read this section of Isaiah, second Isaiah, the suffering servant, this whole topic here. And so, I don't know. I'm not speaking wisely right now.
Well, it's of course it's a feverish expectation by the time of this first century CE And so just the early church, the early Jewish Christian church, identifying that what Isaiah saw, envisioned, is now being fulfilled and realized. And the Messiah which is not at all what the Messiah doesn't turn out to be what was expected. It turns out to be more like these 4 suffering servant texts in Isaiah, which the early church drew from deeply. And but yeah, it's definitely this mystical recognition that this little baby is in some way that one. So, and then of course the bit of the book of Acts is that moving out from Jerusalem to the nations, but as a Jewish mission, right? I mean, that's the thing. It's a Jewish mission of those Jews who believe Jesus as Messiah, as the one who is now anointed to lead them, is basically a fulfillment of our calling as Jews to the nations. So, of course, as we learned in the book of Acts, that broke apart real quick, but I think the vision was there in both Isaiah and Luke and Acts.
Okay, well, thank you.
Before we go, David, I just wanted to introduce my dear first cousin, Katie, down there in the green. Everybody see Katie?
Hey, Katie.
She's a mayor in the state of Washington. She's our favorite relative. One of them.
So you park everywhere and everywhere you want in her town, is that it?
Anywhere. Oh, yeah.
Well, thank
Katie,
you.
I'm glad to see you.
Thanks. for
It's
joining
great
us.
to be here. Thank you for letting me drop in now and then. I don't contribute much. You guys are way over my head, but I always glean something, and I really appreciate it.
Remember what Megan said, if you heard it, she said, everybody has their own little bit of light to contribute, so. And I want everybody to know there's others that actually participate in this group, but never in person. They follow the recordings, and we've been very gratified that some of those folks stepped up and contributed to Or Midbar at the end of the year. And it's great to know that this is a wider, there's ripples to this particular study group. I'm very dear to me, and next week we'll continue where we left off from verse 14. So I won't be sending out a new text next week. We'll just use this one. So if you get this, if you get a link to a text, make sure that it'll be this one. Make sure you don't print it more than you need to. Okay. Thank you everyone for being here. Have a good weekend. Bye-bye.
Take care, everyone.